I went fishing with a buddy a few summers back by a creek we always like to visit. It's a great spot, and if you trek in just a small way, you'll reach a spot that not many know about. It's got plenty of shade and plenty of fish, too. It's been a favorite spot between my buddy and I for quite some time now. We've been going to it for years. This time we showed up there was something there. I don't know how to put it into words other than a Wolfman hybrid. I know it might sound crazy, but that's exactly what this thing looked like. We're coming up to our fishing spot, and both my friend and I stopped dead in our tracks. We saw it before it saw us. We still had our fishing poles in hand, maybe not even 50 yards from the spot. It was in our spot, kneeling down looking into the river. It looked like maybe it was going to grab a fish. After a second or two, it lifted its head up, sniffing the air, and turned to look at us. That's the first time my friend and I really got a good look at this thing, whatever it was. Its size alone was intimidating, to say the least. It freakishly resembled the werewolves of the Underworld movies quite well. It stares at us for a second, then jumps off across the river and the trees, and then it's just gone. Never made much of a sound. For something of that sheer size to just gracefully go through the woods without noise is otherworldly. My friend and I stood there with our jaws on the ground, wanting to know what the hell was that thing. We were a little shaken up, but mostly just in sheer shock of what happened. We spent the rest of the day fishing and talking about it, hoping it would come back so we could get a better look at it. It never did. We have been back to that spot since then and have never seen it again. I almost wonder if it was trying to grab a fish and we spooked it by coming up on it. I don't know how it didn't hear us beforehand. We were casually having a conversation and walking with equipment on, not being mindful at all of trying to be quiet. Let me just say that I trust my dogs with my life. Their instinct is far better than mine, and if they sense something, then I trust it. The thing is, my dogs only really freak out when they sense another dog around, so I tend to keep them by themselves most of the time. I had 3 dogs, and then my third one vanished. I have a Rottweiler mix and a lab, and then I had a smaller weenie dog. The small dog was my late wife's. She just passed away about 2 years ago, so it's just been me and the dog since then. Our neighborhood is relatively small with only a handful of surrounding neighbors. It's quiet most of the time. I let my dogs out to go pee and sometimes just to hang out, get fresh air, that sort of thing. The weenie dog was already outside and had been when this happened. He spends most of his time out in the yard. That's where he likes to be. It's usually just my 2 dogs and me in the house. Well, this one particular night, I went to go let my dogs out and they started acting funny. They were whining. Faintly, but they were still whining. I thought, what the heck? They never whine and not go out. I tried to make them go outside. The door was open, but they just refused. I thought they were acting real funny when their hair started standing up, and they went from whining to acting nervous and being hostile, both their eyes darting around outside the window and around the house. What the heck had gotten into them? I thought. They both started barking up a storm, and here I am yelling at both of them to stop their hollering before they wake up the entire town. Just then, something slammed into the side of the house so hard it knocked me over. Things off my shelves fell, furniture had fallen. I thought somebody drove into the house. My dogs are going apeshit at this point, which they never do. Like I stated earlier, they never act up unless there's another dog around. I should have thought about that. I go running outside thinking somebody crashed into the house somehow. I run outside, it's pitch black. I'm not outside for more than a second before I am greeted with the deepest rumble I've ever heard. After a second of processing the sound, it was a growl that came from a huge animal. That's when the smell hit me. the thick smell of wet dog and urine. It was so strong, like I had just walked into a large cloud of it. I ran back inside the house and slammed the door. My mind is racing a million miles an hour, trying to think of what to do. My mind went to my weenie dog, how he was outside when all this was going on. I started to fear for him, thinking I should go play hero and run out and grab him. I knew there was something outside my small house. I don't know what though. I didn't feel adequately safe enough to brave it. After a while, my dogs did calm down, but the eeriness still lingered in the air. It was late at night, and I struggled to find any rest. Eventually, I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion alone. The next morning, my dogs woke me up, licking my face. I worried about the weenie dog, and I ran outside and he's nowhere to be found. I called his name over and over, and didn't hear him or see him, or any signs of him. I took the time to look around and saw no trails of blood, or tracks or anything that showed the dog was taken. The dirt around my house is very soft and light. My dogs and I always make tracks. We spent some more time looking over by the house when we heard the sounds last night, and what do you know? We found canine tracks. These tracks were double the size of my dogs. They were massive. I knew in my head that we had some large dog here last night. That would explain the urine and wet dog smell. It also explains why my dogs were freaking out. I just think it was some huge wild dog, but I don't know. Those are very big prints for a canine. The largest I've ever seen. I figured a wolf. A huge wolf. I wasn't too concerned about that in the moment, more so finding my other dog. I spent the better part of a few hours trying to track him down and couldn't. Put signs up around the neighborhood looking for him, and nothing ever turned up. I fear that whatever dog it was that came in my backyard that night took him. Considering the obvious size difference and the fact he's so small, I don't think he stood a chance. It's hard for me because that dog meant a lot to me. I recently took this girl out that I've been seeing for a few months now, since the fall. I took her out to my city's waterfront, which is beautiful, by the way. Even in the wintertime, when there's not really many people around, it kind of makes for a little more romance. As we're sitting there, chit-chatting on the bench, she looks over and points off in the distance. She and I both double-take as we have to make reel of what we're seeing. Far away is this really big person with the head of a dog. The legs even looked like a dog. It was dark in color. I couldn't tell from that far away. My date and I just sat there and gasped in awe at what we were seeing. This was a real-life creature in the flesh. It was darting back and forth between the trees, acting somewhat stealthy. There's seldom lights over in that direction, but it just so happened to be in the right spot and looking at the right time to catch it. It looked to be this big shape moving around, which would sometimes move close enough to the light to be able to make out minute details. Again, from the distance, things were kind of hard to tell for sure. I don't know much about things that go bump in the night, other than it was as spooky as it was interesting. My girlfriend and I still talk about it sometimes, trying to guess what it was. I was coming home one night from hanging out with a few buddies for dinner and some drinks. I spent some time at the bar with a couple of old friends that I hadn't seen in forever. So we had dinner, had a couple beers, and catched up for a while. Eventually, we left the bar at around 2 in the morning, heading home and wishing each other well. I'm beyond sober at this point, since I stopped drinking at around 8 or 9 because I didn't want to be anywhere near intoxicated on the road. I get to my house, I think it was around 2:18 in the morning. Where my house is, I have a long concrete driveway. I mean, I guess not really long, but enough you could fit 4 cars until you get to the garage door. On my right side is nothing but tall hedges. For height, I would estimate maybe 12 feet. They spanned the entire length of the driveway, up past my house. I'm getting out of my car, and I'm walking up the driveway. Before I continue, I should state that I park my work truck, so I was parked behind that. This meant I had probably a 30-foot walk to my front door. I'm getting out of the car. It's dark and quite late. It's quiet around 2. I turn to lock my car, and that's when I notice this head staring at me. My eyes, still adjusting to the darkness around me, had to squint to fully make out what I was looking at. I see the silhouette shape of a dog head. German Shepherd, as a matter of fact. Then I see these faintly glowing amber eyes just locked onto me. As soon as I digested the fact that it was indeed a dog head that was that high up in the hedges, and those were its eyes, this awful wave of dread just washed over me. I felt my blood run cold. I turned around and got to my front door faster than I ever have. I'm no runner by any means, but I felt like I could have won a gold medal on the track team. I locked my door and stayed up for hours waiting for whatever it was that I saw to show itself. I never saw it reveal itself. I watched and watched from my window and never saw anything. My front porch light was enough for me to see if there was anything to come out of the hedges. Due to the angle, I couldn't see anything inside of the hedges. Where I was looking was straight down my driveway through my front window, so the hedges were perpendicular to the window. I've told this story to some of my close friends and they just laugh. Honestly, I don't know what it was. The overall size of the thing's head wasn't normal. It had the shape of a shaggy dog and resembled a German Shepherd, but I know those dogs don't get that big. Plus, I had to look up at these eyes, which no dog that I know has glowing amber eyes like that. It wasn't dramatically glowing, but glowing enough that it looked demonic and caught my attention. I just knew deep down in my gut that it wasn't a dog. It was something else. I believe it was a demon of some sort. I'm not a religious person, but what I felt in that moment was pure evil. My granddad has some wild stories to tell. I thought I would share some of them with you. For starters, my granddad lives in Kansas, always has. I think he farms quite a bit out there, but I'm not too sure. We speak sometimes on the phone, so I try and pull as much information out of him as I can. My grandfather is a pretty laid-back guy. It really does take a lot to set him off. Touch one of his tractors, though, and oh man, it's a big deal. His tractors are his pride and joy. I think he has such fond memories of himself riding with his dad and granddad when he was a little boy. Either way, he spends a lot of time on them, and he loves doing what he does. My granddad owns several acres of land he uses and tills and plants a variety of plants and such. I don't know exactly how many acres, but I know he uses many of them for growing things. This is important because it has to do with the story that he told me. Near one of the fields he was out tilling with his tractor. He noticed some sort of strange whistling coming from the tree line near him. He stops his tractor and turns it off to get a better idea of what was making that noise. Out of the woods suddenly jumps this massive Anubis-looking dog creature. That's how my granddad describes it, Anubis-looking. He said it pounced on the tractor. It came out of the trees like a lioness jumping in the air on a gazelle. He said he was so frightened he nearly fell off his tractor and made a beeline for his house. This creature jumped onto his tractor and started tearing the engine out through the side with its claws and jaws. Said it's so big that when it landed on the tractor, he was nearly thrown off himself. He fled for the house and grabbed his shotgun, preparing to kill whatever big Egyptian animal had just attacked him and his tractor. He goes back out there, and this thing is gone, but his tractor's engine was torn halfway out of the tractor and destroyed. Some massive Anubis-looking animal jumps out of the tree line and tears through metal and steel into an engine. My granddad felt like he was going to be called insane if he told anybody. Nothing has that kind of power. And how was he going to talk about this with anybody? At that moment, he had an epiphany that a mere 12 gauge isn't going to do anything to something like this. As scared as he was going to defend his farm and his life. Leaving the tractor there, he didn't come back to that area of his property for days afterwards. He was going to have to get his truck back from his brother, who was currently borrowing it. The truck, I don't remember a make or model, was the only way he was going to tow that torn up tractor away from the area and finish tilling the soil. He had to continue tilling it. Days passed, he got the truck back. Keep in mind at this point, he's living in tremendous amounts of fear and anxiety. His prized tractor was torn up by some sort of mutant dog creature that could tear through metal. He was a mental mess, he told me. Anyway, when he braved up enough to go back to that area to lug the tractor over to his barn is when he saw them. He's driving his truck, stops by the tractor, and tries to make it as quick as he can. He doesn't want to hang around longer than he had to. He parks and starts to get equipment out of the bed of his truck, and notices the stillness around him. This makes him even more uncomfortable. Before he could fully finish that thought, though, he hears a noise behind him. Turning around in response, he is shocked at what he sees. He collapses, smacks his head on his tailgate, and falls unconscious. What he saw, not even 20 feet away from him, were two of the same creatures he just saw a week ago, who pounced on his tractor. There were two of them, but they weren't the mammoth-sized version that he had seen. These were smaller, shorter than him even. My granddad is probably 5'6" on a good day, so these must have been a little smaller. He said they looked young, and that they were probably the creature's kin. Even their features that resemble the creature he had seen, but much more undeveloped and juvenile-like, if that makes sense. They gave him a menacing, intense stare that he believes was set out to intimidate. It scared him so bad he lost his balance, fell, and hit his head, knocking him out in the process. He woke back up and said 12 minutes had passed, judging by his watch. He immediately remembered what he had just seen in the trees. Looking around in a panic, there was no sight of the Anubis-looking beings anywhere. But his truck was gone. My granddad, who is near having a heart attack from fear, just lost his mind. He thought he was going insane. His truck that he had kept running, placed in park, and opened the bed to get supplies out, was now gone. There were no traces of it. It was evident that in the partial soil, the tire marks he had made when he drove up to the tractor. If anyone had hopped in this thing and drove it off, you would see tire tracks in the soil. It was impossible not to have tracks. There were none. It was as if this truck had simply vanished into thin air. The other problem with this is my granddad lives alone, and his nearest neighbors are a mile in either direction. One is an older widow in her 90s. The other is a younger couple in their 40s who raise livestock. The spot in this acreage is where all of this took place, and it's far back behind his house. From the back of his house, you can't see where he is at the time, since it was over a small hill. His driveway is also very long and winding. Again, you can't see his house at the base of his driveway, and you can't see where he was by his house. This means that somebody had to have gone all the way up his driveway without him knowing, and by his house. Then, knew that my granddad was back in that part of the land, came all the way out there, saw the truck, saw that he was unconscious, drove it off the plot of land with no tracks, footprints, or signs of ever being present. It wasn't physically possible. Again, there would be tracks. You would have heard something or saw somebody. My granddad runs as fast as he can back to his house, calls the police, and only explains part of the situation. I was working, slipped and hit my head and knocked myself out. When I awoke, my truck was gone. The police showed up and investigated a stolen vehicle. They checked in around the area, they checked in with his brother, and nothing. Nothing ever did turn up. My granddad started losing it and began feeling like he was on the verge of a psychotic meltdown. Trying to cope and think about how to move forward with his life, he began seeing these creatures come around his land and close to his house. This is when he really felt the need to try and upgrade his weaponry. My granddad had some close buddies of his that served time and somehow had access to weaponry they shouldn't have had access to. It was more of a don't ask, don't tell kind of policy, I was told. They had live grenades, 50 caliber machine guns, poison gas, mines, all sorts of things. My granddad decided against using heavy weaponry against these things because he feared for invoking their wrath. He began to let his farm wither away in fear of going out and being attacked by these beings. They would randomly appear on his farm, sometimes showing up in the dead of night. They would knock on his windows and peer in. Other times, he would see them walking up to his house in broad daylight and then vanish. He ultimately didn't know what to do, but kept his trusty shotgun next to him at all times. He never ended up firing any weapon at these things for two main reasons. One, he feared it would only invoke their wrath upon him and his house. He wanted none of it. And two, he knew his shotgun would probably only tickle an animal that was that fierce and enough to take down a tractor. He knew that if he had shot at the younglings, he probably wouldn't be alive much longer. He restrained out of fear, but understood if they broke into the house, he was going to go out guns blazing. He said sometimes he'd get up early in the morning and see one of the younglings looking in his window. These things were so close to the window, they were making condensation on the glass. I asked him about the description of these beings, and to describe the best he can. He told me they were very dark in color, but the younglings were lighter. He said their face looked very pointed and straight. He said it was like seeing Egyptian mythology in living flesh. They looked exactly like Anubis. Black, dark fur, very short fur, enough that you can see defined muscles, a Doberman pinscher-like head, and a face with a human torso and body, legs like that of a dog, but walking upright. No tail. When he's telling this to me, the first thing that comes to my mind is The Mummy Returns, the movie that came out back in 2001. It has The Rock in it playing the Scorpion King, and Brandon Fraser as the main character. There's a couple of scenes where it shows these Anubis-like beings. I showed my granddad screenshots of those creatures from the movie, and he said the resemblance was close. However, the beings he saw looked eviler and had a wild animal look to them. Their eyes were a striking and intense amber color that seemed to give off a faint glow by themselves. Kind of like neon colors do, but in a different way. Each tooth in their mouth was yellow and looked rotted. Each tooth was razor-sharp tipped. My granddad made an observation that it looked like these things had multiple rows of teeth in their mouth, almost the same way a shark does. The intensity on these things' face and the feel they gave off was everything but benign. Their intelligence was something on an entirely different level. These weren't just animals. These were advanced beings. The way they looked at me, it's like they were reading my thoughts. It's like I knew that they knew that I was afraid. Speaking of fear, you knew when they were around or outside the house because you would feel it. The air would get thicker, harder to breathe. There would be times the air would be full and thick of static electricity. Multiple times did these things press their face against the windows, tapping on the glass, almost as if to taunt him. They would bare their teeth and grin at him, or just watch him intently. It's like these beings were there to incite fear and to try and intimidate and scare him away. That's why he kept mentioning the intelligence of these things was astounding. To give some more details to exactly what he talks about when he says that he saw them, he is referring to the two small Anubis-looking beings. He told me after the story he never ended up seeing the large one again. He wondered if that was the alpha male, or the pack leader, or the father or mother. He thinks it might have been protecting its younglings, whatever on God's green earth it was. It's the only thing that really makes sense to him. They must have been passing through in that area, and it's possible he just got a little too close and Mama or Papa attacked. He attempted different means of trying to protect himself. He got his brother to come out and told him he was having bear problems. His brother laid out several active bear traps all around the property, dug different hole traps, covered the bear traps, and set up about 10 to 12 game cams around his property. My granddad never left the house during this next week, out of fear of these things showing up. Brother came back to check on the traps and the game cams, and noticed that all the traps were gone. No idea where they had gone or who took them. All 8 of the bear traps that he placed around the area were gone. Every game cam was gone too. No traces of them anywhere. Now his brother is freaking out, and at this point hadn't yet seen these Anubis beings quite yet. As his brother is off collecting, or trying to collect any trap or game cam he set out earlier, is when he felt like he was being stalked. He said he felt like a large predator was around and following him. He suspected it to be a mountain lion at first, but wasn't too sure. He kept a pistol at his belt at all times, just in case, to deter any unwanted animals. He shot it up in the air to try and scare away anything that was around. That is when he heard a low snarl from behind a tree. He pointed his pistol, ready for whatever was behind. Out steps these 2 canine beings, the same ones my granddad had been seeing. These beings come out of the brush and come toward his brother. His brother fled, never said anything to my granddad, and just left. Whatever these things were, they were causing him serious issues. He told me he felt desperate and not sure where to turn to try and rid these things off of his land. He had called the police for an intruder on his property, and they had basically told him to just install security to help. After these beings constantly being around his property, he decided to go stay at a friend's house indefinitely. The house is paid off in full and has been for a long time. Letting it sit there for a while isn't going to be too bad. But he decided after staying at this friend's house for around 2 weeks, it was time to tough things out for the better. Upon coming back to his house and land, for the first time in a while he said he felt a sense of peace. Listening closely to his surroundings, he could hear birds chirping in the distance. This gave him hope. After a few days, things seemed to have calmed down. Perhaps these beings moved out of the area. He's not sure. Eventually, weeks went on and there were virtually zero sign of these beings being around at all. He even was able to borrow a truck to get his tractor moved and bought a newer one. His farm went to hell for a while because he wasn't able to maintain anything. He had to start over for a lot of things. He never did find what happened to his truck, game cams, and bear traps. He felt like he could finally start over again, and he did. He still lives there to this day and says he hasn't had a single encounter with anything that stands out. Normally I'd call him a bullshitter, but he's a stern, serious individual. He would have put so much time into faking the story. When he told it to me, he spent a couple of hours diving into every little detail. So, I apologize for only writing to you what I can remember. There's no way he would have just come up with something like that. I am also an avid cryptozoology researcher, so when he told me about this happening, I just wanted to hear more. I believe, based off his account, that it is indeed a form of Dogman. When I kept asking for him to describe these beings to me, he just kept pointing back to the Anubis Egyptian god. This only happened 12 years ago.